afterwards. Okay, so I'd now like to introduce Paul LeBlanc, who's well known to most of you, if not all of you. Paul, I think, has been involved with the IARO since it actually began, or at least for most of its existence. And he was an active member until his retirement. And of course, he was the IARO president from 2012 to 2014. Looking at his career, Paul was the first project manager for Heathrow Express and subsequently became BAA Rail's Director of Strategy. So absolutely delighted to welcome Paul, to introduce him and for him to give the third of our webinars, the history of Heathrow Express. Paul, over to you, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks very much, Patrick. And just check, you are seeing the slides on the screen now, are you?
We're seeing it perfectly, yeah, that's great.
Excellent, good, all right. Okay, well, thanks very much for the introduction. So much of this talk relies on my own memory and research, but I also want to acknowledge the help of a significant number of people, some of whom are indeed on this call today. Too numerous to mention. You'll probably recognize some of the things that I say as what you told me. But anyway, thank you very much for that. Always very, very helpful. So what I'd like to do today is to take you through this story from what I call the early days. And I'll probably be spending most of the time on getting on the bits in the middle of this, sort of getting the approval and the designing and building elements. Because that was when I was personally involved, as Patrick said, up till about 2000 or so. I will cover a little bit of the more recent history, but for two reasons, that'll be slightly less. Partly, as I say, because I was less involved, if not involved at all. But also, of course, IARO over the years has had lots of presentations about Heathrow Express and the operating time from various people in the business. So you will have heard all that during those 20 or so years. So that's the way I'll deal with it. I will cover the operating aspects for a little bit towards the end. Okay, so going back to the early days, I mean, there were airport railways before the Second World War, but some very interesting post-war planning for London was done actually during the war, and one of the key plans was done by Sir Patrick Abercrombie, who came up with a London plan and indeed a Greater London plan. And this is one of the diagrams from the Greater London plan. He was concerned with all sorts of issues to do with land use, transportation, housing, agriculture, and the green belt, as we have around London. This particular plan shows, it's not very clear, but you can see some transport networks. There are roads and railways shown on here. The sort of orangey brown dots are actually meant to be new towns. So that was to do with where residential communities would be built. And there are little airplane symbols which you can see around. And in fact, there were a sort of ring of airfields identified. Some of which could be connected by rail, and indeed there is a mention of rail access to airports in this. Not all of these plans survived, but some principles were laid down, and I think that was quite an interesting drive. I'm jumping on a bit now because Heathrow was established as the London airport from immediately after the Second World War, and grew fairly rapidly, particularly through the 50s and 60s, with 3 terminals opening in the airport central area in that period, and it grew pretty rapidly all that time. But by the 1960s, the main public transport to Heathrow, certainly from central London, was by airline coaches, and the 2 main British airlines, BEA, BOAC, operated dedicated coaches from their London terminals, either in Gloucester Road, which is sort of West London, or at Victoria. And that was the main form of public transport. However, there was beginning to be a problem with road traffic congestion. The M4, the main motorway, was built mostly in the 1960s and reached Heathrow in the 1960s. But nevertheless, there was still road traffic congestion, actually in particular at the airport. So the airport central area where these 3 terminals were served by a single tunnel, well, a twin tunnel bore, was getting quite congested. So there was a study done in the late 1960s, which reported in 1970, called the Heathrow Rail Link Study. And that basically considered 3 BR, that's to say mainline options, and 1 LT, that's to say an underground option. And the 3 BR options were all variations of a southern link, what we now understand and call a southern link, going to the southern region, obviously to the south of Heathrow, and then via the southern network into central London. And the LT, or underground link, was basically an extension of the Piccadilly line, which then terminated at Hounslow West into the airport. And what came out of that study was that the LT option, the Piccadilly line extension, was significantly better in a number of ways, financial and operational and so on, and seemed to be the best one. So it was selected as the first link to Heathrow. And indeed, it opened all the way to Heathrow Central in 1977. And there is the Queen in the front cab of that first train that I think many of us have seen before. And I should mention here, by the way, that I think that the Piccadilly line extension to Heathrow, the Piccadilly line to Heathrow, can actually claim to be the world's most successful airport rail link. And that claim, I think you can say on the basis that it handles a significant mode share of passengers, and bear in mind Heathrow is a very large airport, and it also carries a significant number of airport staff. And again, so if you measure the success of an airport rail link on the basis of the absolute number of passengers, either staff or air passengers who use it, I have a feeling that the Piccadilly line could actually claim to be the best or the biggest in that sense. Of course, I'm sure IARO would be delighted to host a discussion to consider various competing claims for that. However, the 1970s had seen a big change in airports policy for London, and a plan to create what was by then a third London airport off the coast of Essex to the east of London had been put forward in the early 70s. It was cancelled in 1974 and replaced by a strategy of incremental growth at 3 existing airports. Those 3 existing airports being Heathrow, Gatwick, which by then had become London's second airport, and Stansted, which was held in reserve. So the strategy in terms of airport development as a whole was moved from being a big bang at a third London airport to this incremental expansion of Heathrow with a 4th terminal, Gatwick with a 2nd terminal, and then Stansted with a new terminal. So the strategy changed over that period, and there were various public inquiries, but the third of those public inquiries, and what became the major one, took place in 1981-83, and by this time Heathrow Terminal 4 had been approved and I think was probably under construction. Gatwick's 2nd terminal, or North Terminal as it became, had also been approved. So this inquiry was into the 3rd stage. Initially, that was just to consider expansion at Stansted, but it was expanded. That's to say, the inquiry was expanded to cover a number of other proposals, plans, one of which was a 5th terminal at Heathrow. Bear in mind, we've got approval for a 4th terminal, which is being built, and the plan was the original plan was that would be it. But various parties brought forward the idea of a 5th terminal at Heathrow, and the airports inquiries of 81-83 considered that as a proposal. The decisions from that inquiry were announced in a white paper in 1985, and those decisions were that the plan to expand Stansted was approved, albeit in somewhat limited way, but nevertheless was approved. And the decision on Terminal 5 was that the actual proposal that was put forward was rejected in detail, but the principle was, I won't say approved. I think you could say the door was left open or possibly unlocked, because the suggestion was that if you wanted to have a fifth terminal at Heathrow, you would have to do a couple of things. One of which was find a way of getting to land, but the second one was you would need some form of mainline rail link. So that became a sort of condition of any possible future fifth terminal. And just to finish off, this white paper of 1985, somewhat coincidentally, although it is very relevant, said that all the airports should be privatized. They were, up until that point, nationalized industries or indeed owned by local authorities in the UK. And bear in mind, this is 1985, so this is in the middle of the Thatcher Conservative government who was privatizing everything. And airports came up in that program around that time. And indeed, they were privatized in the next couple of years. And although that's, as I say, somewhat coincidental in terms of the development decisions, it was relevant, as we'll see in a minute. So the study that, or rather the condition that Heathrow would need a mainline rail link if it was to move forward for a fifth terminal came up in the Heathrow Surface Access Study, another study of 1980, which was reported in 1987. This one was, I think, somewhat wider than the previous study in that they considered something like 40 separate options, of which there were groups, and there were a group of BR, i.e. mainline options, but this time not just for southern links, but also using the western region into Paddington, and indeed different terminals in London. Some of the options involved creating some sort of express route along the Piccadilly line, basically by building a couple of extra tracks and having trains going faster. I suppose a bit like the Chicago CTA Blue Line to O'Hare. There was also an alternative using the Central Line, the underground Central Line, extending that. And there were various suggestions of people movers, basically with a completely new route from central London, maybe an overhead monorail or something like that. And there were a number of road-based options, which basically means express coaches using the road network. So that was the 1987 study, and this table from that very simplified version of the table shows some of the results from some of the options. So basically, the underground Piccadilly line options on the left-hand side, sorry, in the top line, a couple of the BR options, and then the people mover option. In terms of mode share, they were all pretty good, although the BR options did get you a better mode share than the others, so that's a positive result. The costs were variable, and not surprisingly, the people mover was the most expensive because it required completely new infrastructure all the way into central London. The revenue cost ratio, they were a bit mixed, but the BR ones were pretty good, to be honest. And there was something called the net rail return, which I think took account of the fact that you would lose revenue on the Piccadilly line if you took mode share away. So that was another measure of finance. And from that, it was fairly clear that the BR options would probably be better. And interestingly enough, not only that, it doesn't really come out of these figures, but not only would they be better, but there was a good chance that a mainline link would actually be profitable in the sense of not just covering its operating costs, but actually making a return on the capital investment. That sort of thing is fairly unheard of in rail investments, but nevertheless, there was that chance, and that was a bit of a surprise to many people, I think, that there was that sort of positive result. Yeah, I'm just referring to my notes here, make sure I don't get myself lost. Okay, so we then move to BAA and BR, creating a joint venture. Now, this is interesting here because BAA by then had moved into the private sector and was a private sector company, BR was still a nationalized industry. BAA, as a nationalized industry, BAA had been prevented from doing anything other than running airports. That was basically, that was its remit. It was allowed to run airports, but it couldn't do anything else. When it was privatized, that leash was taken off, and like many organizations, it suddenly decided to try diversification. It did all sorts of things. It started developing hotels, albeit airport hotels. It started developing shopping centres in association with a shopping centre developer, and various other things. And then one of the things it found it could do was it could get involved in railways because it wasn't constrained from doing so. BR obviously had the main expertise in doing that, and so BAA got together with BR and produced a joint venture. And I think this is quite interesting because this indicates one of the motivations behind Heathrow Express. That, if you recall, a few moments ago I was talking about it being a possible way of enabling a fifth terminal to be built at Heathrow. And so there were people in BA. I mean, bear in mind, this time we're talking about the late 80s. Terminal 5 was not government policy and was not even BAA policy because it only just opened Terminal 5 and it was developing Stansted. So, but there were people in BAA who thought this is interesting that we can do this and it might enable us to expand Heathrow at a later date. At the same time, this could make us a profit. So, almost irrespective of the other motivation, this could be profitable, or at the very least, it wouldn't be a loss maker to us. So I think there's an interesting juxtaposition of those two motivations. And I just slightly contrast those with, I think I'm right in saying that when Stephen Mayer talked to us a month ago about the two Canadian air rail links at Toronto and Vancouver, the motivation there was or at least the deadline, the timing was as much about particular events taking place. So I think one was the Pan American Games and one was a Winter Olympics. That wasn't the case with Heathrow Express, but there were other motivations around at the time. So the joint venture went forward, and the way that you get permission to build railways in the UK is through Parliament. There are other ways as well, but the traditional way, as it is through a bill, a private bill in Parliament. Incidentally, HS2, the high-speed line being built in the UK, has also been approved by Parliament, or partly approved by Parliament through a bill. But in this case, it's what's known as a hybrid bill, which is government supported and part private. The Heathrow Express railway bill was totally private, even though BR was in the public sector. It's still called a private bill, and it goes through Parliament in much the same way as any legislation. Goes through both houses of Parliament with a first reading, a second reading, a committee stage, and then a final reading, and then eventually royal assent. So it took us about 2.5 years. It was quite a tricky process, but nevertheless we went through the parliamentary bill process. And I have to show this picture because, of course, when you're going through Parliament, you've got to get politicians on side. So here's a group of people. This, I think, is around 1990 and was taken at a Conservative Party conference, which they held every year. So second from the left, believe it or not, that is me. Yes, look at all that hair. Amazing, isn't it? Slim as well. Next to me on my left, or to the right of me, is Kenneth Baker, who I think had some sort of transport. He might have even been Secretary of State at the time. And a couple along, that lady, that's Margaret Thatcher. So she was involved and she was asking intelligent questions. There are a few other people there. The chap on the far right, by the way, some of you may recognize him. That's Andrew Haynes. Now, Andrew at the time was may have been managing director or perhaps even just development director or something of Great Western Railway, which was relevant to all of this. But Andrew, of course, has gone on to really big things, and for a while was the chief executive of the CAA, the Civil Aviation Authority, and is now the chief executive of Network Rail. So that was an interesting picture, and I showed this to him recently, and we had a bit of a laugh about these party conferences. Anyway, good fun, and that's, you know, you have to do your bit of lobbying. So the Heathrow Express bill was approved and becomes the Heathrow Express Railway Act of 1991, which gives us permission to build. I just want to talk a little bit about the route that we were promoting. Of course, the route involved the existing Great Western Main Line from Paddington for about 11 miles out to the west to Airport Junction, where that model you saw in the previous slide was a model of Airport Junction. And then the route came due south from Airport Junction towards the Heathrow, and that's about 5 miles in total. There's a couple of things I'd like to point out about this route. When we first started promoting this route in Parliament, it would have been above ground all the way from Airport Junction to just north of the runway. So about half the length would have been above ground with a big viaduct over the M4 motorway. When we got into Parliament, there were some objections to this because it was felt it would split up a bit of open land and make it vulnerable to development. So we were required to bury it, literally, to put it underground instead. And that was not easy because the first section, labelled as cut and cover here. Sorry, there's somebody, I can hear some background. Can you make sure you're muted? Not quite sure who it is, but anyway, thanks. The first section, labelled cut and cover, goes through land which was previously used as a refuse tip. And nobody was quite sure exactly what was in this refuse tip. There weren't very good records. So the design was quite tricky because we had to clear out the refuse and then create a waterproof box for the tunnel.
Sorry,
made
Paul.
Sure that we didn't.
Sorry to interrupt, Paul. Sorry, Paul. Andrew Young, could you mute yourself, please? We can actually hear your background noise. Sorry to interrupt everybody, but it's interfering with the president. Thank you. Okay, thanks, Andrew. Okay, so yes, the cut and cover was quite a tricky design, and I think that there was this possibility of methane ingress into the tunnel, and we all sort of had this fear of the first train going in, you know, with its overhead wire pantograph sparking and a huge explosion as this methane exploded. So there's a lot of monitoring and care taken in that case, which I'm sure still actually happens these days to this day. So interesting. It cost us quite a bit of money, extra money, and we lost probably 6 months in the build process doing that, but nevertheless that had to be done. And the rest of it, as you see, is bored tunnel. The second point I wanted to pick out about this route is you may think, why this shape? Why is it this sort of inverted question mark or hook shape? Why didn't we just go straight north-south from Airport Junction to Terminal 1 and then to Terminal 4? Well, there are a couple of reasons for that. One is, as you can see from the diagram, the buildings in the central area and indeed Terminal 4 are all aligned in a sort of northwest, northeast, southwest direction. They're not north, south, east, west. They're on the angle. And when you're designing underground structures, it's often better to try and align them with basically with the buildings above, so that the foundations and so on are that way. So that's one of the reasons. The second reason was that it allowed us to contemplate extending to Terminal 5, which is over to the west of Terminal 3 at a later date, more or less pointing in the right direction. I'll show you another diagram later that shows that take place. Now, bear in mind, this is all being promoted and planned in the late 80s and early 90s, when Terminal 5 was still certainly not approved, let alone built, and wasn't even policy. So there was some, if you like, some good forward thinking and some good forward planning here. But it was a risk. You know, there might not have been a Terminal 5, and we might have been stuck with that loop, which is obviously more expensive to build than a straightforward line.
Okay, so anyway, I moved on from Heathrow Express after the Act had been approved, and the whole management changed, as you would expect, you know, because we now move from a period of planning to detailed design and then construction operations. And of course, many of you will know this chap who effectively or did take over as the managing director and subsequently chairman of Heathrow Express. This is Rod Hoare. Rod was a fantastic character and absolutely the right person for this job to take it forward. Sadly, we lost Rod in 2016. A few years ago, he died, but he was really good. And the whole, as I said, the whole new management team, some of whom are on this call today, came into being. Now, as far as the design and construction are concerned, it's interesting that BR, and at the time, this is still the early 90s, this still was BR. It did move to in a minute, and I'll explain that in a minute. But BR did all the work from Paddington, electrifying the main line and building Airport Junction. And at the same time, it coincided with a major project they were doing to remodel the approaches to Paddington Station and indeed to re-signal them, which was going on in any event. And I mean, the fact is that BR, as it was then, did this work on time and, as far as I'm aware, more or less to budget. You know, with all the stories you hear about rail projects these days, it's interesting to know that I think this was all done very well, as they say, and done on time and to budget. So that was good. However, the same can't be said of the BAA works, which were essentially in the branch line, the new line in tunnel. This is a more detailed diagram of the central area station. And just bear in mind that north is to the sort of top right of this, so this is slightly angled. But basically, the Heathrow Central Station, I'm sure you all know, consists of two platform tunnels on the outside, and then a central concourse tunnel running down the middle, and with various cross passages and so on. And then connections to the terminals basically at either end. That's where the connections were. So that was the basic tunnel, and you can see there some sort of attempt to try and align it with the buildings above. Now, unfortunately, we had a bit of a collapse, a very significant collapse of some of the tunneling in the area on the left-hand side of there that's sort of darkish red color. We were fortunate, nobody was hurt. It was tunneling is a dangerous thing to do anyway, and I won't go into the details of it. But fortunately, it was seen to be happening, and we were able to get people out quickly. But nevertheless, it did cause a major problem. We probably lost about a year in trying to recover from it, and I think it cost something of the order of £150 million extra on top of the original budget. So it was a very significant event, and indeed, lots of lessons were learned. There was a prosecution at the end of the day, and some of the organisations involved were fined. But there were, I think, two positive things came out of it. One was that in recovering from this collapse, all the organisations involved, designers, contractors, the BAA, Heathrow Express, and indeed other parties like LT, because obviously we were tunnelling beneath the Piccadilly line, all got together and found a solution quickly, and didn't worry about whose responsibility it was. That all came later. So there was some very, very positive working came out of that, which I think was a very good lesson. The other positive thing about it was that in order to dig out the material that collapsed, we built a 60-metre diameter cofferdam, which you can see on this diagram. The initial design for this end of the station had been relatively small shafts and incline shafts for escalators, a bit like what happened at the other end, at the Terminal 1 end. But instead of that, because we had to get rid of all this material, we built this cofferdam. And what that did was to create a huge space in which the lifts and escalators were eventually built, with, you know, a much more open space, and actually a much better, if you like, much better welcome space to either welcome to Heathrow Express or welcome to the terminals. That wasn't the original design, but it certainly came out of this collapse. So that was interesting, and did cause some difficulties at the time, and the people involved in that are to be congratulated on getting out of it quickly. The rolling stock was also being designed at this time, and the top diagram shows some of the original exterior shots. But you may also, if you're a train geek, you may also notice that this looks very much like a networker, which was a train being built for Network Southeast at the time. And indeed, our colleagues in Network Southeast, which is part of British Rail, were keen on us buying a version of this train because it would have matched others. In the end, we didn't. We went for a Siemens design, which is the bottom one, and it looks very different externally. But we spent a lot of time thinking about the interior design as well, the layout of the seating and the baggage racks, etc., etc. And again, I'm sure you've heard all of that. And there's no doubt that these trains at the time were very much state of the art, certainly for a short distance train of this nature. Things have caught up, and most trains these days are at least as good as this, if not better. But certainly it was very much state of the art at the time. Now, one of the other consequences of the tunnel collapse, by the way, was that, as I mentioned earlier, the BR works had been completed. So the Paddington Station, effectively, the electrification and the airport junction had been completed, and the trains were ready by 1997. But the delay to the central area stations at Heathrow meant that we couldn't get through to there. So we decided that just for a temporary period, we'd operate a service to a temporary station just south of Airport Junction, and we called this Fast Train. So essentially what you had was a train, a shuttle train from Paddington to this temporary station, where it was met by coaches. So on this diagram, I'm afraid it's not a very good picture, but on the diagram, on the picture, you'll see a coach on the right there. So the train, there was a direct cross-platform interchange to a coach, and there was a coach each for Terminal 1, Terminal 2, and Terminal 3, and Terminal 4, I think, I can't remember, some are combined. And the coach went straight to the terminals. And it was quite an interesting plan because it allowed us to test the trains under a sort of lighter service. So that was very helpful because we all know that trains sometimes don't work immediately out of the box. It also allowed us to warm up the market, as it were. So you know, there was a lower fare for this and a fairly light marketing scheme. So we were able to just test and make sure passengers were happy with it. And it was quite interesting to do because, you know, this is not an insubstantial piece of work to do that was only there for a year or so. But in the end, it was probably worth it. I should say, by the way, I meant to say this when we were talking about the BAA-BR joint venture, that, of course, in the 1990s, BR itself was privatized later than the other companies. And in fact, I think Railtrack, which was the original infrastructure provider, started in 1994. And the train operators were franchised from about 1996 onwards. And what this meant was that it was difficult for BR to become, to remain as a sort of complete partner in this. So gradually the joint venture moved from a 50-50 joint venture through to effectively 100% BAA ownership anyway, with Railtrack and others acting as contractors or partners in that sense, but not financial ones. Okay, so we get to 1998, 23rd of June, and that was when it was opened. Apologise, I haven't got a picture of the actual opening, but it was, honestly, it was these two guys who opened it. Although Mr. Blair is looking rather miserable, I'm not quite sure why. But I couldn't find a picture of them actually doing the opening. And Sir John Egan was by then the BAA chief executive in the private sector. And these are the two guys that opened it. Some people say that this is typical of a project that the last stage of a project is when, you know, on opening day and you line up all the dignitaries and shake hands and so on. And most of whom hadn't actually had much to do with the project at all. So this is known as praise for the uninvolved. And I think there was a fair bit of that around at the time. And some of the people who had been involved earlier were a little peeved that they weren't on the line of dignitaries, but never mind. It was opened and reasonably successfully, although I think Ben Harding told me a story about some slight near misses with opening day, but nobody knows about those. Okay, so 1998, this period was, of course, a golden time for airport expresses. So Hong Kong Airport Express, top left, had opened, I think opened later that year in 1998. My notes right on that. And similarly, Oslo's Flytoget had opened in 1998. And then Stockholm's Arlanda Express, I think, opened a year later in 1999. So this was, you know, really a golden time for airport expresses. And that indeed is when, more or less, when IARO was set up, because there were several of these organizations, operations around the world. And we thought, you know, we'll try and get together and share our best practice and see what we're doing, because there wasn't anything else like it in the rest of the country. How are we doing for time? Okay. So operations began in 1998, and as I say, I'm not going to cover this in great detail, except to say that it was pretty successful most of the time, and operated pretty well in terms of performance, reliability, and so on. One of the major events that did take place, of course, was the extension to Terminal 5, which by that time had gone through all the planning process. Indeed, I had been involved a little bit in the public inquiry for Terminal 5, specifically on rail access. So that opened with the terminal in 2006. And this little diagram, which, if you remember the previous diagram of the sort of hook shape, this is the bottom bit of that. And if you can see my arrow on here, coming down through Heathrow, terminals 1, 2, 3, down to Terminal 4. This also happens to show the Piccadilly line loop on here, by the way, which is of interest. So you'll see here that because the Heathrow Express was sort of pointing in this southwest direction, it was actually relatively easy to plan and design an extension over to Terminal 5. And of course, this is all underground as well. So there was no real objection or concern about any environmental impacts of an above ground line. So that was relatively straightforward, and went through, in this case, it actually went through not as a parliamentary bill, but it went through as part of the Terminal 5 application process. Now, as I'm sure many of you know, there was another bit of sort of longer term planning involved with this, and I say many of you know because I think you may have visited it on an IARO workshop. But over at the Terminal 5 station, in addition to the two platforms that are currently in use, there is a big open space box, if you like, next to it, beneath the terminal, which is there and was put in there to enable other services to come in and for 2 more platforms. Nobody was quite sure where those other services would be from, and still not entirely sure, but that box is there and was built as part of the construction of Terminal 5, of course, when there was an opportunity to do so. So another bit of what I like to think is good long-term planning at Terminal 5. So what else took place during this operational period? It's a very long period, and I'm afraid I'm really just covering it very quickly. Well, performance generally kept up well. I'll talk a little bit about numbers in the next slide. One of the things that did evolve gradually was the branding. So you'll see the original Heathrow Express branding at the top and what is more like today. So it's very similar, The X has remained, but changing shape. Nothing too dramatic, but a nice sort of steady evolution of branding. This is a graph which I produced this morning because I was trying to make sure I had all the data, and I'm not sure all my data is correct, or indeed there might be sort of incompatibilities about it. But what I'm trying to show here is what has happened in terms of numbers. So the left-hand scale, the blue bars are literally air passenger numbers, and you'll see that that grew fairly rapidly to sort of 4 or 5 million, and sort of stayed at around that level for many years, and then grew a bit in the second decade of this graph, up and down a bit. And the mode share, which is the orange line on the right-hand scale, again grew to around 10–11%, and more or less stayed at about that level. I'm missing a bit of data in the 2000s, by the way, so it probably wasn't as straight a line as that. It probably jiggled up and down a bit. So the pattern there, I think, is fairly interesting, in that it reached that level and grew. You know, the mode share kept and grew with the airport growing as well, with some ups and downs. You can see a clear dip, for example, in 2008-09, which is the last financial problems, economic downturn. I'm not sure if I got the figures right for the last couple of years, 2018, 2019, and goodness knows what it is for 2020. But anyway, it's that sort of pattern. And one of the things I think was interesting was the relationship between that and the pricing strategy. And what happened was that in the early years, the pricing strategy was, this is a premium service, so the basic premium fare, I think we started at £10 for a single journey. It went up fairly rapidly in real terms, that's to say, you know, after inflation. So the price sort of went up to about £20 fairly rapidly. And if you like, that held down any growth in the absolute numbers. So it was very much a revenue maximizing policy. And that, I think, continued probably till about the mid-20 teens, so about 2014, 2015. And I remember Fraser Brown telling me that at that stage, they began to think about this, whether this revenue maximizing strategy was right. They were thinking ahead to possible competition. And so they began to introduce a whole series of other fares. Headline fare remained the premium, £20, £25, but they began to introduce advanced fares, child fares, all sorts of other things like that, that meant that you might be able to attract more members. That did seem to be having some effect, certainly in 2017. As I say, I'm not entirely sure what happened in 2018, 2019, but nevertheless, that revenue maximizing strategy did change. What I would say about it, of course, though, is that the revenue maximizing strategy meant that this was indeed a very profitable venture. So not only was it covering its operating costs, but it was making a pure profit in whatever way you want to measure it. Andrew Sharp may know the more detailed figures, but I get the impression from the BAA's accounts that recently, and certainly over the last few years, revenue from rail has been of the order of 120, 130 million pounds a year, and the operating costs are about 70 million a year, 60 or 70 million. So you can see immediately that there's some sort of 50, 60 million pounds of I don't know if you want to call it surplus or revenue or profit or whatever, but that's giving you your return on your capital investment, which, by the way, by the time Terminal 5 was included in everything, ended up to being close on £1 billion. So a 50 or 60 million pounds annual return on £1 billion is, okay, it's only 5 or 6%, but it's not bad, and showed that it was a good decision in the first place. Okay, just to come to an end now, what's happened most recently, of course, as I'm sure you're all aware, is that the Class 332s have reached the end of their life and been taken out of service and been replaced by these Class 387s. And I think they're now operating the service. A number of reasons to do with this. Partly the 332s had sort of reached the end of their life, or at least reached a period when they'd they'd have to undergo major refurbishment. There was also an issue with the depot, which was needed for HS2, and to relocate the depot would have been very difficult. So the idea of using these trains, which are maintained as an existing Great Western Railway depot, came into force. Also, there were other changes to the track access agreement and the operating agreement, which is now effectively done by Great Western Railway. So a whole series of things came together, which meant that these trains are now operating at Heathrow Express service. I don't know too much of the details of that. Others may know more than me. So that's basically the end, and be very interested to hear any questions you might have or comments. I would just point out that I have written this up in a little book, which you see on the right there. It's not very long, only about 60, 70 pages or something like that. So lots of this stuff comes from there, and there are a few other little anecdotes and stories. It's not published in the sense of being printed by anybody or published by any publisher. So it's simply a PDF. And I think the plan is that we'll send a copy of this electronically to all of you some stage in the next, or after this meeting's finished.
That's right, Paul. I'll forward it on to everybody on this call later today. Actually, I've got a copy of it, and I read through it. It's a very readable book, actually. So very interesting. I only saw it the other day, but you know, I read it in an hour, and it's very interesting. A lot of good detail.
So I'll stop sharing, and then we can see if there's any questions, I guess.
Paul, no, thank you very much indeed. I think if we weren't all on mute, we'd all give you a very hearty round of applause. It's very, very interesting, fascinating, huge amount of detail and knowledge. So thank you for that. I'm not sure if you can see, Paul, but we are actually getting a few questions coming in on the chat line. Kerry,
I'll start looking at those.
I don't know if you can see them, but Kerry Bangle was asking, did it ever pay back the capital costs?
Well, yes, Kerry. I mean, as you'll have seen from sort of penultimate slide or so, essentially, yes. Not only did it pay back the capital cost, but it gave you some sort of reasonable return. Not spectacular, but certainly good enough to make sure it was worth doing.
And Mark, you may have seen the message from Mark Warburton. Did the start of the Heathrow Connect commuter service have an impact on ridership? It didn't look like it based on that graph. Does Heathrow manage that as well?
I think, Mark, the answer is no, not really, because the Heathrow Connect service was always intended to be an additional supplementary service that really served the intermediate stations between Heathrow and Paddington rather than Paddington itself. Some people may have chosen the Heathrow Connect service because it was cheaper, but I don't think many, and I don't think there's a real dent in it.
Lee Sims, originally there were check-in baggage drop at Paddington. How did this interact with the operations?
Well, that's a whole other story, which again, I know IARO has discussed at the various workshops for places around the world as to where it works and where it doesn't work. The interaction with operations in the sense that the first car, or at least the country end, as you call it, the one the front of the train leaving Paddington, half of that was designated for baggage, and special baggage containers were created. So bags that were checked in at Paddington, which was down at the other end, as it were transported by a conveyor beneath the platforms up to the far end, loaded onto these containers, and then the containers were loaded onto the trains. And at the other end, containers were taken off the trains, went up in the lifts, and were taken by little vehicles round to the various baggage areas. It was quite a smooth operation, and the claim always was that the number of bags lost in that was minuscule compared with the number of bags lost in the overall scheme of things, as it were, when we travelled by air. So it worked very well, but it was expensive. There's no doubt about it. It was expensive for the airlines in particular to operate, because not that many people chose to use it. and you know, the number of passengers per member of staff at Paddington was very small. So in the end, the airlines pulled out. It was compounded by the 9/11 security issues, which meant that the American airlines had a particular concern about security. But I mean, I think, to be honest, even if it wasn't for that, I think there would have been a problem with the basic finances, which we've seen in other places as well.
Paul, this is Ben Harding, the
Yes,
original MD of Heathrow Express. I think the issue with check-in is it was a time when people were going to cabin baggage. And remember that Heathrow Express was after the business traveller who rarely have checked in baggage.
Yeah, very good point. Yes, absolutely.
We have another question from Ilkwan Che. Is it okay to maintenance and cover OPEX costs? Because I think market share is not enough to cover OPEX. Can you answer that?
Well, no, I think it is. I think, as I understood it, as I said, I mentioned one or two figures, and Andrew's just given me the thumbs up. I think the operating costs were fully covered by the revenue, and more, such that you then made a return on your capital employed. So I think the answer is yes, they were well covered. Not often the case, but with railways, but certainly in this case, yes.
Paul, if you're making 70 million a year for the best part of 20 years, then and that is after operating, that is on operating costs, then you're covering your capital costs as well, probably. So I think that answers both Kerry's question and this one.
Yes, indeed. I can see a question from Steve Costello there, Steve. So your question is about the current forecast for Crossrail abstraction. This is another long story that nobody will know the answer until it actually happens. And of course, many of you will know that Crossrail, or as it will be called, the Elizabeth line, is not yet fully operational to Heathrow, and I think is now due either later this year or possibly early 2022. The folks in Transport for London, who essentially are the promoters and the owners of Crossrail and Elizabeth line, think that it's going to devastate Heathrow Express. That everybody's going to choose to use the Elizabeth line, and everybody will abandon Heathrow Express because it's cheap. It goes through Paddington and onto the centre of London. On the other hand, many of us, including me, to be honest, think that it will have some effect, but that Heathrow Express will actually be able to maintain close to its current market share of around 10%. If anything, I think Crossrail or Elizabeth line will abstract passengers from the Piccadilly line, because in some respects, well, it's sort of halfway, isn't it? The Elizabeth line is a metro. It looks like a metro. It hasn't got many seats. It doesn't have toilets. It stops at every station, and that's some of it. I'm not sure about toilets, but that's one of its advantages, is that it does actually stop at every station. It's very regular, and of course it's very modern, and it serves beyond Paddington, as it were, east of Paddington, the rest of London. So in that sense, it's good. But you might argue it's a bit closer to the Piccadilly line, which is a similar metro service, stopping at all stations, albeit, the Piccadilly line is small diameter tube stock, and the Elizabeth line is full size stock. So who knows? I don't know. Various guesses were made, but I think, as is often said, all forecasts are wrong, especially those about the future.
Yes.
So nobody knows. Yeah, Steve, I mean, you'll know this because you've attempted to make forecasts of how the Southern Link, which you're promoting, will work, and that's incredibly difficult. It's so difficult to make those sort of forecasts.
It is, yeah. I think part of the problem is the operating hours. If you've got early flights, early check-in, or people worrying about getting home late at night after the last train, that has an effect as well. So yeah, you're right. It's an impossible prediction. But very good. Thank you.
Okay.
Another question from Mr. Coogan. Would your life have been easier if Terminal 5 had been conceived earlier and Terminal 4 would have been placed somewhere else?
Matthew, are you thinking specifically about Heathrow Express in that context?
Yes, you are forced to treat Terminal 4 as a stub add-on, which is not quite what your vision was. You were supposed to say, yes, your life would have been easier if Terminal 4 was in the right place.
Yeah. Oh, yes. The answer is yes. No, you're absolutely right. And again, Ben may be able to contribute to this, but although I claimed it was good forward thinking that the route of Heathrow Express was such that Terminal 5 was easier, of course, in some respects, having two spurs, one down to Terminal 4 and one to Terminal 5, did make it particularly tricky. The original plan, for those of us who don't know about these things but think it's a whizzo idea, the original plan was to have the trains splitting and joining. So you'd have an 8-car train coming to Heathrow from Paddington. The front portion would then go on to Terminal 5 and the rear portion would go to Terminal 4, and in the reverse direction they would join up together, much like those of you who know the I think is it Hamburg arrangements work at some intermediate station. So we all thought that was a whizzo idea and would work very well, but there were some people who in the operating part of Heathrow Express who thought that might affect our reliability and performance, and as we, that was very high priority to get 100%, effectively 100% reliability. We ended up not being able to do that. So we have more or less the current pattern, which is that the main trains go to Heathrow Terminal 5 and there's a shuttle service to Terminal 4.
Could I add to that, Paul, that a few years back, I was in Heathrow Express's offices and the then operations director came up with what he regarded as the idea of the millennium, which was to run the front 4 cars to Terminal 5 and the rear 4 cars to Terminal 4. And they did actually try it, only to find that the connections on the train wouldn't work and the timetable just fell apart. It just wasn't manageable. As you say, it does in Hamburg. And in fact, I was able to give people the right contacts in Hamburg to go and talk to them. But there was something wrong with the couplers on our trains, which was different to the couplers on the Hamburg and indeed Hanover trains. So it sadly it didn't work, just as well we never tried it.
Yeah, okay.
We have one from Martin Brown. How about mode shares? How do the mode shares of Heathrow Express and Piccadilly line compare?
Okay, well, as I said right at the beginning, the Piccadilly line actually does very well, and I think I'm right in saying that it gets about a 17% market share of air passengers. I'm not sure what the market share of staff is, but much higher than Heathrow Express. So yes, there's no doubt Piccadilly line is better, if you like, at getting gets more air passengers and certainly more staff to Heathrow than does Heathrow Express.
Coming back to Crossrail again from Lee Sims. I know you slightly touched on, but how will Crossrail affect operations? I don't know if that's different from what you were saying in terms of numbers.
Yes, yeah, I think it is. Well, I think as I understand it, the initial plan is for Crossrail to run 4 trains an hour. I shall have to look to Andrew to see if I got this right. 4 trains an hour to Terminal 4.
I think so, yes.
Yes. So Heathrow Express will continue to run 4 trains an hour to Terminal 5, and Crossrail or Elizabeth Line will run 4 trains an hour to Terminal 4 initially. However, I think there's also a plan to increase the number of Crossrail trains to 6 an hour, of which 2 will also go to Terminal 5. So I think that's the current plan. But I mean, these things may well change over the years. What you get on day 1 may not be the same as in day 5 or year 5 or 10 or what have you. And I'm sure the service will evolve over the years.
What's the current estimate for day 1 then, in terms of when is day 1?
Well, I thought I heard it said as 2021, late 2021, but I'm not sure.
So this year, basically, we are in 2021 now, aren't we?
Yeah. I mean, don't forget. No, again, Andrew, correct me if I go wrong here. Crossrail trains are currently running to Heathrow, but only to Paddington. So they're just doing the Paddington Heathrow shuttle, as it were, under a is it the TfL Rail brand?
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Something like that, isn't it? Yeah. So it's not until they run through Paddington under the tunnels that they'll be called Elizabeth Line.
And that won't be this year. Not through the tunnels, I don't think.
So, Paul, I know your presentation was about the history, but we are looking forward now with the Western Rail Access. This is from James Bradley. With the Western Rail Access scheme in development, do you see potential in Heathrow Express going to Reading or elsewhere?
Yes, I mean that question sort of follows quite nicely from the last one, because, as I said, don't expect the operations of the Elizabeth Line or indeed Heathrow Express to stay static. And if and when a Western link or indeed a Southern link is built, the infrastructure's there, and the pattern of services might well change. So you might well find some of these services going through Heathrow, either from Paddington and going through Heathrow, either to Reading or indeed on a Southern link. Not necessarily, but that's an option. Once you've got the infrastructure, you've got other potential options, and it depends what works well. You know, sometimes you don't want to have too complicated an operation, because you'll lose reliability. So sometimes it might be better to have two shuttle services, you know, which meet each other instead of one through service.
Another comment from Andrew. This is obviously a personal experience. He says Crossrail seats are very hard. I don't know if that's going to affect the age profile of people going on Crossrail, or indeed the lack of toilets may affect the age profile of people going on Crossrail. But that's a useful comment.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah. Well, you know, I mean, again, IARO has been very good, because we've looked around the world at all sorts of different air rail links, and sometimes we have to eat our own words. And one area where I thought that was always the case was in Vancouver. With I don't know if Stefan's with us today, but when we all went to Vancouver to see the Canada Line, it's called the Vancouver Airport. There's hardly any seats on that train at all, and what there are, you know, are sort of fairly typical North American. I'm not sure if they're completely plastic bucket seats, but certainly, you know, very washable. Let's put it that way. And yet, you know, it's an amazingly popular line. It works very well for airport passengers as well as others. So these things are never that simple. You know, it might seem nice to have a very comfy cloth seat with lots of springing in it, but not necessarily.
Just going back to the point on splitting trains from Bob, a good point there. I think passenger confusion as well when splitting trains. I'm actually on the right train, so I think that's a useful point.
Yes, true.
Yeah, so I think that covers most of the questions. Still time if anyone else got any other comments they'd like to make. I think we've looked both at history and we've also looked at forward thinking as well.
It was good fun doing that little bit of research. As some of you may know, I wrote a book about airports policy. I'm not trying to advertise it here, by the way, but it is available at all good bookshops. And some of you may have seen this. And that took me, the previous book took me several years. I started it as an academic exercise and then eventually continued it just as a book. And I got into the habit of doing the sort of research and so on. And I thought, well, actually, why don't I do something similar for Heathrow Express? Now, Heathrow Express is a smaller story and more contained, and therefore it was easier to do. But it is good fun. So I thoroughly recommend if when you finish being paid for doing any work, write a book.
A couple of more comments. Luggage space, reliability, access to downtown, and price competitive with taxi limo are reasons why the Canada line. So going back to the Canada line there.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Even if the seats are hard. That's from Ken Peel. Yeah.
I mean, one of the interesting, again, other interesting comparisons with Stefan's talk last week was, I think he spoke quite a bit about the Toronto situation, about the premium pricing of the original premium pricing, and of course that was, you get that quite a lot. I know our friends in Stockholm were often criticised as being, you know, you're an elite service only available to people who can afford the fare and so on. And it's a huge debate. You know, should you have these sorts of things, which are premium fare, premium price, or should you have a low, in effect, subsidised price? We have arguments in the UK about Gatwick Express, for example, as to whether it is really a premium service any better than the others there. At Stansted as well. I mean, a little different at Stansted because there isn't anything to compete with it. So you pay a premium fare, and well, until recently didn't get much of a premium service, to be honest.
So I'm going to ask you an impossible question, Paul, but obviously this is a history lesson of sorts. So with the benefit of hindsight, is there anything that you think could or should have been done differently, looking back at the history?
Oh, I should have rehearsed that one because
yeah, I'm sorry, I should have given you warning. Apologies.
Yeah, and I haven't, so I can't think of anything. No, it was all perfect.
Yeah,
it was
so, yeah.
Wonderful.
Maybe anyone else want to comment?
Yes, please. I'd love to comment on that. As the operator, the trains were very pretty, but not ideal to operate because I couldn't walk staff from end to end because they're in 2 units,
okay,
which was a disaster in pricing cost and needing to do it. The lifts, the escalators are the obvious way and the dangerous way, and I've had these stations laid out differently. So we would get people onto the lifts as the first choice. And that would have been about station design. And the list actually goes on and on. I'm afraid, not to say it's not an outstanding service. There hasn't been a huge success.
No, it's just always, you know, it's always good to look at what could have been done differently. I mean, just so that people can learn in the future and just as a comparison, I guess.
I remember, Ben, you told me this wonderful story about the smelly toilets.
Oh, yes.
I mean, that's it. You know, it's such a fundamentally simple piece of plumbing that apparently the toilets had a bend in them, so the waste pipe had a bend in it, which blocked. You know, and that's nothing to do with train design or airport expresses. That's basic plumbing, isn't it?
Yes, I mean the background to that is when we started operating, we had some very high-level technical problems with the auxiliary converters, which everybody concentrated on fixing. And our customers only ever complained about the toilets rather than slow trains because the auxiliary converters weren't working. And that's quite a good lesson in what customers care about rather than engineers.
Yeah, these are important things, aren't they?
Mm.
Bob, did you have something you want to say? Yes. You're on mute at the moment.
Yeah, back in Manchester when I was there, coming about escalators, I think, you know, when Heathrow Express was designed, I think this sort of concept of escalators versus lifts and escalators being unsafe probably wasn't there. In Manchester was effectively designed the same way, not with the big escalators. So, you know, it was noticeable in sort of the time I was there when I left that there's a move towards sort of stopping people using escalators for the reasons you've said, you know, very sound safety reasons. But I think to be fair to the people in the sort of 1990s when this was being put together, escalators were, I think, the sort of the obvious way forward, really. And I know Manchester Sound is not on the call today, but certainly what I've seen of their redesign for the station is effectively, you know, ruling out escalators in favour of big lifts and good big lifts. So I think that's a sort of common theme that the industry's learned about. And the point about toilets, back in my time at Manchester, at the consultative committee, the conversation was always about toilets. So.
An interesting point on lifts is that it's not at the Heathrow Express stations, but if you use the lifts at Terminal 5 to go airside, so between the core building and the satellites, you have to go quite a long way down to get to the transit. The people mover down there, and you have a choice of lifts or escalators, and the escalators are always, as Ben was saying, first in the watch where the staff go, watch where the airline crew goes, because they use it, and they all head to the lifts because they know it's quicker. They all go to the lifts.
The other thing about the cofferdam, Paul, and that solution was about the escalators in there. It always reminds me, I used to go down to London quite a lot in those days, but we were trying to develop our station for meetings. And one of my colleagues, Peter was absolutely horrified of heights. So he just would not like to use those long escalators in the cofferdam, the T3 end. He doesn't, he's petrified of the height scenario.
Right.
So
Okay.
whilst it's sort of, they're aesthetically great and move people up and down, if you didn't like heights, my wife's in the same boat again, she'd be horrified looking over the side of the escalator.
Yeah. Yeah. Good.
Okay. If there are no other final points, I'd just like to thank you again, Paul. Really appreciate it. I'll be circulating a copy of this presentation, as I say, circulating a copy of your book in PDF form later on today. Just before we finish, I'd like to give an initial announcement about the next webinar. We're trying to plan a schedule in a series of webinars over the coming months. I'm delighted to announce that the next one is going to be a joint presentation from Matt Coogan. Matt, who you know is an independent consultant. He's been on the line and many of you know him. And also Martin Brown from the IARO, the Assistant Director for Airport Development at IARO. They're going to be doing a joint presentation in a month or so's time. Matt's actually going to start off by looking at how hard the transportation sector has been hit by the pandemic and why. And for this project, he's been actually involved in a multitude of surveys, allowing him to track and follow either the work from home, or its equal, the lack of commute for all demographic groups, with particular emphasis on job category. And so for the webinar that we're planning, he's going to be presenting a comparison of US and UK data. And he tells me that he's graphed them out and they're remarkably similar. That's going to be very interesting. That's going to be the first part of the webinar. And that's going to be, I'm saying balanced, but the other side of that's going to be a presentation from Martin, who's going to be providing information, which he's got both from IARO economist and himself, on how the industry has been affected by the pandemic and the latest prognosis for the future. So he's going to be covering passenger numbers, cargo volumes, financial impacts, as well as some of the changes in operations and strategy at airlines and airports. So it's going to be a combination of two very topical and very interesting subjects, which I'm sure will add up to a fascinating webinar and discussion. The date of the webinar, we provisionally set that for Thursday, the 8th of April. So we'll do it at the same time. It gives people a chance in the States as well as in Europe to listen in, and anyone in Asia. And I know we have one or two listeners from Asia. I'm afraid it's a bit late for them, but it'll be more or less the same time. But I'll be confirming the date and the time in the next few days and sending out a note about that. So in the meantime, thank you again for participating. Very much appreciate that. And on behalf of you all, thank you to Paul for a really interesting presentation, very nicely presented and lots of good diagrams and information. We'll finish it later and look forward to seeing you all again soon. Thanks again. Bye-bye for now. I'm going to close it off.